Hello, everybody. For National Paralegal College, my name is Stephen Haas, and today I would like to discuss the political appointments of President-elect Donald Trump and the roles that the other branches of government, specifically the Senate, will have in confirming or not confirming those appointments. Now, I suppose one possibility would be to simply allow the people to vote up or down on every single appointment of the President of the United States, but the Constitution has something a little bit different in mind. The Constitution gives the Senate the power to advise and consent for appointments not only for the judiciary, but also for various cabinet members. The Appointments Clause, along with the Advice and Consent Clauses, appears in Article 2 of the United States Constitution in Section 2, which says that the President shall have the power to make treaties, provided that two-thirds of the Senate present concur. That's not what I want to look at. What I want to look at is the next Appointments Clause. By the advice and consent of the Senate can appoint ambassadors, other public ministers or consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not herein provided for, which shall be established by law. And in other portions of the Constitution, it also applies this similar rule that the President can appoint and the Senate can confirm, or the Senate can advise and consent for lower federal judges, federal appellate court judges, and federal district court judges. Controversy over appointments dates all the way back to the very beginning of the United States. In fact, it was the basis for one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history, that of Marbury versus Madison, which took place back in 1803. What happened there is that outgoing President John Adams appointed a series of Federalist judges right before he was about to leave office. However, once he did leave office, the incoming president, Thomas Jefferson, refused to allow his Secretary of State, James Madison, to deliver the commissions to these judges and thus formally appoint them. One of the judges, who was supposed to be appointed under the Adams appointment rule, filed a lawsuit under a federal law which allowed the Supreme Court to force officers of the United States to deliver these judicial appointments. That was the basis for Marbury versus Madison. The United States Supreme Court eventually found that the rule that allowed the court to force the federal government or force the executive branch to deliver these appointments were unconstitutional, and that was the first example in the history of the United States in which an act of Congress was declared to be unconstitutional, and that's really where you get the importance of Marbury versus Madison. But I did want to point out that this idea of exactly how an executive agency or how the president must or may appoint judges and the role of Congress and the role of the other branches in that has really been in controversy from the very beginning of the Republic. Now, this came to a head last February when one of the 9 justices on the United States Supreme Court, Justice Antonin Scalia, passed away. When that happened, President Obama announced, of course, as is generally expected, that he was going to appoint another justice to the United States Supreme Court, and Senate Republicans, namely Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, announced that they, as the majority party, which has the ability to stop any nominee from being voted, were going to stop any appointment and not so much as allow a vote. Now, President Obama eventually did appoint Merrick Garland to the United States Supreme Court, a relatively moderate justice, but the Republicans, given the fact that it was an election year, and they figured they might do better after the election, refused to allow a vote. Now, of course, some people were very upset about that. Some people argued that Garland's position was stolen by the Republicans who refused to do what they considered to be the Republicans' constitutional duty to advise and consent, or at least to allow a vote on whether Garland should be allowed to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the analysis at the time indicated that they really did not have any constitutional responsibility to vote. I have pieces here that I've seen from The Atlantic, from The Washington Post, from media outlets that are certainly not conservative by nature, the consensus is that the Republicans really didn't have any responsibility. It may or may not have been politically a good idea or ethically a good idea, but the Republicans didn't have any constitutional responsibility to allow an up or down vote on Garland's nomination. This article, or this section from a Washington Post article, explains that the language in the Appointments Clause, which we just looked at a little while ago, makes the Senate's consent a prerequisite to Senate appointments, but it does not place any duty on the Senate, nor describe how it should proceed in its decision-making process. The shall that we looked at, the president shall nominate, only modifies the president's responsibility. It doesn't actually modify the responsibility of Congress. Congress doesn't actually have to do anything, and in fact, that is what the Republicans chose to do. And given that without the advice and consent of the Senate, President Obama did not have the ability to appoint Garland to the U.S. Supreme Court, the Garland nomination was never voted on, and certainly now that President-elect Trump is going to take office in a couple of weeks, Judge Garland will go back to whatever he was doing beforehand, but he is not going to be on the United States Supreme Court. So that's one aspect of the Senate's power to advise and consent regarding appointments. The other aspect I wanted to discuss is the quote unquote filibuster. Now, the filibuster, pictured here in the classic Jimmy Stewart movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where one senator in the old days, or in a real filibuster where a senator actually gets up and keeps talking and talking and talking, as Jimmy Stewart did in the movie for about 24 hours until a bill is killed or not killed, depending on what happens in the end. But a filibuster basically is where a minority of senators block a legislation or block a judicial appointment by refusing to allow a vote on it because it takes 60 votes to cut off debate. So if 41 senators want to continue debate, theoretically they can do so ad infinitum. A Jimmy Stewart movie, you had to actually stand there for 24 hours, but in real life, you basically just raise your hand and say filibuster. And if you can't get 41 votes, then if you can't get 60 votes to cut off the filibuster, then the filibuster basically kills the legislation. Now, in 2005, Democratic senators who had 45 seats wanted to block a few judicial appointments of President George W. Bush, and they threatened to filibuster those nominees. And the Republican who were in charge of the Senate didn't like that idea, and they decided that they were going to blow up the filibuster by basically voting to change the rules so that you don't have the right to filibuster and you need the full 50 votes in order to block a nominee. And both sides were a little hesitant about that. Obviously, the Democrats didn't want the Republicans to blow up the filibuster, and the Republicans weren't so sanguine about blowing up the filibuster because they realized that the party that's in the minority today might be in the majority tomorrow, and vice versa. And so, therefore, 7 Republican senators and 7 Democratic senators got together in what was called the Gang of 14. And the Gang of 14 essentially said, okay, we won't blow up the filibuster, we won't use the quote unquote nuclear option. And in exchange, you be really, really careful about who you filibuster. You may recognize some of the senators. We've got John McCain in there. You've got Olympia Snowe. You've got Susan Collins. You've got Orrin Hatch. All of these senators were members of the Gang of 14. Now, that worked for 2005. However, about 8 years later, in 2013, the Democrats, when the shoe was on the other foot, this time you had a Democratic president and you had a Democratic majority in the Senate, and the Republicans were now trying to block a nomination using the filibuster. The Democrats, under Harry Reid, did vote to get rid of the filibuster for everything except for U.S. Supreme Court nominees, and also legislation in general. So in other words, as of this rule, as of 2013, you can block legislation or U.S. Supreme Court appointment with just 41 votes. However, you need 50 to block a nomination of a lower federal judge or an executive branch nomination. So where does that leave us now? Well, you may recall that the advice and consent requirement, in other words, the requirement that a presidential appointment be submitted to the Senate for advice and consent, only applies for officers of the United States. It doesn't apply for lower officers. It doesn't apply for people who the president just wants for advice. It doesn't apply to, White House staff. It really only applies to cabinet members, to people who are going to be leading departments. There was some controversy about this in 2009 when President Obama appointed a bunch of people without the advice and consent of the Senate, calling them czars. They didn't have official government, they didn't have official cabinet powers, but they just kind of had advisory powers, and there was some controversy about them back then, and I did an analysis of the news at that time as well. But if you look at, for example, President Trump's appointments, there are some of them that aren't going to require Senate confirmation at all. People who are just hired in staffing or advisory positions. Steve Bannon, Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor, White House Counsel, who's just a member of the White House staff, Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, which is a very powerful position, but it is not an officer of the United States, and it's not a cabinet. It's not a cabinet position. These others over here are cabinet position. Head of the Housing and Urban Development, Defense, Secretary of State, Homeland Security, DOJ. These are all people who are clearly officers of the United States, members of the executive branch, and members of the cabinet. They will have to be appointed by Congress, but because of the fact that the filibuster was blown up in 2013, they will only require 51 votes. So for example, right now there are 52 Republican senators in the Senate. Well, there are 52. There will be 52 Republican senators in January, and there are 48 Democratic senators, and the Democrats will not be able to filibuster any appointments because the filibuster has not been allowed since 2013 for lower federal judges and for appointments. So, in order to block any of these nominees, there are going to have to be at least two Republicans that go along with blocking the nominees. In terms of Supreme Court justices, that they will be able to filibuster, theoretically. If, for example, President elect Trump appoints a new justice who is objectionable to Democrats to replace or to fill up the ninth seat, which was vacated by Scalia's death and not filled because of the lack of a vote on Merrick Garland, the Democrats will be able to filibuster that. If they do, however, then there's no reason inherently why the Republicans can't take what Harry Reid did in 2013 and take it one step further and say, okay, you blew up the filibuster for appointments and for lower federal judges. We're going to take that one step further and blow up the filibuster for Supreme Court justices as well. That may very well happen if there is an attempt to filibuster any Trump nominees. On the other hand, some of these nominees may get certain objections from sitting Republican senators, and they might not be confirmed at all. But overall, based on the appointments clause and the fact that Republicans will now control the Senate and the presidency, the Democrats in general are in a fairly weak position to block any Trump nominees, including everybody on this page and lower federal judges, and maybe even Supreme Court judges, in part because of the maneuver that they did in 2013 to stop the Republicans from doing the same thing, which is a lesson that people have to learn in politics, that the shoe will be on the other foot one day, so be careful what you do to the minority because the minority might be where you are in a couple of years from now. So thank you very much for listening. Please post any comments and I'm happy to respond to any questions that anybody posts here. Thank you very much for listening. Have a wonderful day. And this is Stephen Haas for National Paralegal College.